they never get to hear what it sounded like.
EA Sports. It's in the game.
The Civil War was fought in 10,000 places. Murfreesboro, Chambersburg, Drainesville, and Opelousas. Apache Canyon, St. Augustine, Paducah, and Brandy Station. On the Red River, the Rappahannock, and the Rapidan. Across the Susquehanna and the Monongahela. From Mount Ida and Mount Olive to Mount Zion. From Nineveh and Nickajack Gap to New Bern, New Carthage, New Iberia, New Lisbon, and New Hope. From the Yazoo Delta to the Chickasaw Bluffs.
Sproles on the return.
By 1863, the Taiping Rebellion in China had entered its 13th year. Civil War broke out in Afghanistan. In America, Eddie Cuthbert of the Philadelphia Keystones stole the first base in professional baseball. The National Academy of Science was founded in Washington. The roller skate was patented. Henry Ford and William Randolph Hearst were born. In 1863, Confederate General Stonewall Jackson would become a terror to the Union Army and a legend north and south. Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, a college professor from Maine, would lead his regiment to glory on hillsides in Virginia and Pennsylvania. In the wilderness west of Fredericksburg, Robert E. Lee would devise one of the most daring and brilliant battle plans of the war. While 1,000 miles to the west, Ulysses S. Grant continued to hammer away at the rebel stronghold at Vicksburg. Confederate Private Sam Watkins would fight at Murfreesboro, Shelbyville, Chickamauga, Lookout Mountain, and Missionary Ridge, and somehow survive. While Elisha Hunt Rhodes would have the best 4th of July of his life. In 1863, despite a Northern victory at Antietam, despite emancipation, despite a clear superiority in men and materiel, the Union seemed close to fumbling all it had. Meanwhile, from Vicksburg to Charleston, the fragile Confederate coalition was coming apart. And yet somehow the Confederacy stayed alive by the daring and luck and genius of its high command. But the biggest tests were coming that summer, where the Mississippi took a sharp turn at Vicksburg and at a sleepy corner of Pennsylvania.
Murfreesboro, Tennessee, January the 1st, 1863. Martha, I can inform you that I have seen the monkey show at last, and I don't want to see it no more. I never want to go on another fight anymore, sister. I want to come home worse than I ever did before. Thomas Warburg.
Charles Coffin, Boston Journal. All the surrounding forests had disappeared, built into huts with chimneys of sticks and mud or cut for burning in the stone fireplaces. The soldiers were discouraged. They knew that they had fought bravely, but that there had been mismanagement and inefficient generalship.
Ball on the 45-yard line.
Falmouth, Virginia. This morning we found ourselves covered with snow that had fallen during the night. It is too cold to write. How I would like to have some of those on to Richmond fellows out here with us. Elijah Hunt Rhodes.
The men of the Army of the Potomac had not been paid for 6 months, and while Army warehouses at Washington bulged with food, little of it got to the winter camp.
I do not believe I have ever seen greater misery from sickness than now exists in our Army of the Potomac. Thomas F. Purley, Inspector General.
one Wisconsin officer called the winter camp at Falmouth, Virginia, the Union's Valley Forge. Hundreds died from scurvy, dysentery, typhoid, diphtheria, pneumonia. There were epidemics of measles, mumps, and other childhood diseases. And farm boys, crowded with other men for the first time in their lives, were especially susceptible. Disease was the chief killer of the war, taking 2 for every 1 who died of battle wounds.
One of the wonders of these times was the army cough. And it is almost a literal fact that when 100,000 men began to stir at reveille, the sound of their coughing would drown out that of the beating drums.
The newspapers say the army is eager for another fight. It is false. They are heartily sick of battles that produce no results.
I don't think I have received half of my letters. It cannot be possible that 1 is my quota in over 3 weeks from home. I've written constantly from every place where we have stopped long enough to write and could mail a letter. Edward Hastings Ripley.
200 men deserted every day. By late January, a quarter of the Union Army was absent without leave. Added to the men's misery were memories of the battle they had fought across the Rappahannock at Fredericksburg in December.
Azamula recovers the fumble.
At Fredericksburg, there was an exchange across the Rappahannock. One of them hollered, "Hey, Reb." I said, "Yeah? When are you fellas going to come over?" I said, "When we get good and ready. What do you want?" He said, "Want Fredericksburg. Don't you wish you may get it?" And things like that. There were a lot of those exchanges.
A line of hills overlooked Fredericksburg, Virginia, a key Confederate transportation link midway between Richmond and Washington. Union General Ambrose E. Burnside's plan had been to cross the Rappahannock by pontoon, occupy the town, then take the thinly defended heights. Bold action did not come naturally to Ambrose Burnside, though he had led his men to Fredericksburg, determined to display the fighting spirit his predecessor George McClellan had so conspicuously lacked. But now the War Department failed him, and 17 days passed waiting for pontoon bridges to arrive. By the time the bridge was in place, Lee had 75,000 men waiting in the hills. Stonewall Jackson was on the right. James Longstreet on the left, along a bluff called Marie's Heights.
Ball on the 36-yard line.
From the top of the heights, Lee could just see Chatham Mansion across the river on the Union side, where 30 years before he had quartered his wife, Mary Custis. It was now Burnside's headquarters. On December 11th, Union guns began shelling Fredericksburg, setting much of the town on fire. Then the troops started across the river. Some wondered why the Confederates did not make it harder for them to cross. "They want to get us in," one private said. "Getting out won't be quite so smart and easy."
The field goal attempt is no good.
While waiting to attack the heights, Union men looted what was left of the town. The Great Assault came 2 days later on December 13th. Federal forces advanced toward Marie's Heights. Lee could not believe the enemy would be so foolish. His artillery covered all the approaches. 4 lines of riflemen waited behind a stone wall that ran along the base of the hill. General and officer assured James Longstreet, "A chicken could not live in that field when we open on it."
How beautifully they came on. Their bright bayonets glistening in the sunlight made the line look like a huge serpent of blue and steel. We could see our shells bursting in their ranks, making great gaps, but on they came as though they would go straight through us and over us. Now we gave them canister, and that staggered them. A few more paces onward, and the Georgians in the road below us rose up and let loose a storm of lead into the faces of the advancing brigade.
The brilliant assault of their Irish brigade was beyond description.
we forgot they were fighting us, and cheer after cheer at their fearlessness went up along our lines. General George Pickett.
It was suicide. They came forward, one man said, as though they were breasting a storm of rain and sleet. Faces and bodies half turned to the storm, shoulders shrugged. The Irish Brigade got within 25 paces of the wall. The men of the 24th Georgia who shot them down were Irish too. A Union officer watching from a church steeple saw brigade after brigade charge the stone wall. They seemed to melt, he said, like snow coming down on warm ground.
Tomlinson with the carry. Gain of 6.
They still believed that to take a position, you massed your men and moved up and gave them the bayonet. There were practically no bayonet wounds in the Civil War, much more than there were in the First World War or the Second. They never came in that kind of contact, or at least very seldom came in that kind of contact. But they still thought that to mass their fire, they had to mass their men. So they lined up and marched up toward an entrenched line and got blown away.
14 assaults were beaten back from Marie's Heights before Burnside decided it could not be taken. 9,000 men fell before the Confederate guns.
More credit for valor is given to Confederate soldiers. They're supposed to have had more elan and dash. Actually, I know of no braver men in either army than the Union troops at Fredericksburg, which is a serious defeat. But to keep charging that wall at the foot of Marie's Heights after all the failures they've been, and they were all failures, is a singular instance of valor.
Watching from above, even Robert E. Lee was moved. It is well, he said, that war is so terrible. We should grow too fond of it. Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain and his 20th Maine were among the thousands of Union men pinned down at the foot of the heights. That night, the temperature fell below freezing and a stiff wind blew. Men now froze as well as bled to death. Night brought quiet.
2nd and 6.
But out of that silence rose new sounds more appalling still, a strange ventriloquism of which you could not locate the source. A smothered moan, as if 1,000 discords were flowing together into a keynote, weird, unearthly, terrible to hear and bear, yet startling with its nearness. The writhing concord broken by cries for help, some begging for a drop of water, some calling on God for pity, and some on friendly hands to finish what the enemy had so horribly begun. Some with delirious, dreamy voices, murmuring loved names as if the dearest were bending over them. And underneath, all the time, the deep bass note from closed lips, too hopeless or too heroic to articulate their agony. At last, outwearied and depressed, I moved 2 dead men a little and lay down between them, making a pillow of the breast of a third. Drew the flap of his overcoat over my face and tried to sleep. Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain.
They were stuck there all night and all the next day, crouching behind a wall of their own dead, trying not to hear the Confederate bullets thudding into the corpses of their friends.
San Diego.
Burnside, openly weeping, declared that he himself would lead the new attack. Subordinates talked him out of it. That night, Chamberlain and his men scraped out shallow graves for the dead. As they worked, the northern lights began to dance in the winter sky.
Who would not pass on as they did, dead for their country's life, and lighted to burial by the meteor splendors of their native sky?
It's very unusual to see the northern lights that far south, but the whole heavens were lit up with streamers of fire and whatever the northern lights are. And the Confederates took it as a sign that God Almighty himself was celebrating the Confederate victory.
The slaughter is terrible, the result disastrous.
2nd and 4.
Until we have good generals, it is useless to fight battles.
The Union had lost 12,600 men. The South had lost 5,300 men. But many of them were only missing, gone home for Christmas.
5-yard gain on the play.
The battered Union Army limped back across the river. Icy rain began to fall. From the ruins of Fredericksburg, Confederate soldiers openly taunted the Union troops huddled miserably on the far side of the Rappahannock.
After the Battle of Fredericksburg, the Confederates went back into the town and they saw all the damage that had been done during the Union occupation of the town. It was a great deal of damage, real vandalism. And they were shocked, and someone on Jackson's staff said, "How are we going to put an end to all this kind of thing?" And Jackson said, "Kill them.
2nd and 8.
Kill them all."
Ball on the 36-yard line.
Clarksville, those hateful gunboats. They looked like they were from the lower regions. Now this is the 2nd night that 4 of them have been anchored in the river opposite our house. I see the men crawling about on the boats like so many black snakes. Manny Haskins.
1,500 Union men were now stationed at Clarksville, Tennessee. No one could enter or leave the town without a military pass.
40-yard line.
Every day, Mrs. D.N. Kennedy wrote her husband in Georgia, "The reins are tightened." On Deer Isle, Maine, the parents of Private Harleton Powers learned that he was among the missing at Fredericksburg. In fact, his fellow soldiers were certain he was dead, but had been unable to recognize his body among the swollen, blackened Union corpses. His father placed a stone to his memory anyway in the little cemetery at Southwest Harbor. Private Alfred Robbins, age 20, collapsed and died while on his way to mail a letter in camp near Port Hudson, Louisiana. The cause was never discovered. In March, Corporal Farnham Haskell's coffin came home from Louisiana and was buried at Mount Adams Cemetery, despite the great difficulty of digging a grave in the frozen ground.
The ball carrier, loss of 2 on the play.
During the long, cold, rainy winter of 1863, Confederate forces huddled in defensive positions south of the Duck River near Tullahoma, Tennessee. Confederate officers like to explain that Tullahoma came from the Greek word tulla, meaning mud, and homa, meaning more mud.
Gain of 8 on the play.
The Confederacy was on the move. Confederate General John C. Pemberton beat back Union forces trying to take the Chickasaw Bluffs north of Vicksburg. John Morgan's Confederate cavalry raided Kentucky, burning bridges, twisting train tracks, and taking 2,000 Union prisoners. And Nathan Bedford Forrest was driving the Union Army mad everywhere he went, stealing horses, harrying supply lines, attacking armies 4 times the strength of his, then disappearing without a trace. In 2 weeks, Forrest stole 10,000 rifles, wrecked $3 million worth of equipment, and cut U.S. Grant's lifelines and forced him to retreat.
Jordan, the ball carrier, 1-yard gain on the play.
In Texas, General John B. Magruder captured a Union flotilla at Galveston. After the bombardment was over, Confederate Major A.M. Lee went aboard the badly hit USS Harriet Lane. There he found his son, a Federal lieutenant, dying on the deck.
January 24, near Falmouth. Daylight showed a strange scene. Men, horses, artillery, pontoons, and wagons were stuck in the mud. Rebels put up a sign marked, "Burnside stuck in the mud."
3rd and 5.
We can fight rebels, but not in the mud. Elijah Hunt Rhodes.
I wish you could hear Joshua give off a command and see him ride along the battalion on his white horse. He looked so splendidly. He told me last night that he never felt so well in his life. Tom Chamberlain.
What makes it strange is that I should have gained 12 pounds living on worms.
Chargers 10, the Raiders.
We live so mean here that hard bread is all worms and the meat stinks like hell. And rice 2 or 3 times a week and worms as long as your finger. I liked rice once, but goddamn the stuff now.
It was no uncommon occurrence for a man to find the surface of his pot of coffee swimming with weevils after breaking up hardtack in it. But they were easily skimmed off and left no distinctive flavor behind.
On the carry,
Tell Ma that I think of her beans and collards often and wish for some. But wishing does no good. Benjamin Franklin Jackson.
Union troops were issued beans, bacon, pickled beef, called salt horse by the men, desiccated compressed mixed vegetables, and hardtack. Square flour and water biscuits, hard enough, some said, they could stop bullets.
The pass falls incomplete.
In the Southern Army, you ate something called slush. You got issued cornmeal and bacon, and you fried the bacon, which left a great deal of grease in the pan. Then you took the cornmeal and swirled it around in the grease to make the dough. Then you might take the dough and make a snake of it and put it around your ramrod and cook it over the campfire. That was called slush. They ate a lot of that.
Coffee was the preferred drink of both armies. Union troops crushed the beans with their rifle butts, drank 4 pints of it a day, strong enough, one man said, to float an iron wedge. And when they could not build a fire, were content to chew the grounds. Southerners made do with substitutes brewed from peanuts, potatoes, and chicory.
We have been living on the contents of those boxes you sent to us. Nothing was spoiled except that card of biscuits. Those were molded some, but we used over half of them in a soup. Thank Mr. Burdix 1,000 times for me, also Mrs. Maxson for those pies. And those fried cakes and ginger snaps are first rate, and the dried berries, they're nice, and the dried beef and applesauce, that was first rate.
Ball on the 16-yard line.
No one agent so much obstructs this army as the degrading vice of drunkenness. Total abstinence would be worth 50,000 men to the armies of the United States. General George McClellan.
Number 56.
If a soldier couldn't buy it, he made it. One Union recipe called for bark juice, tar water, turpentine, brown sugar, lamp oil, and alcohol.
Ball on the 21-yard line.
Southerners sometimes dropped in raw meat and let the mixture ferment for a month or so to add what one veteran remembered as an old and mellow taste. The men called their home brew Knock 'em Stiff, Pop Skull, and Obie Joyful.
Jordan on the run. No gain on the play.
I invited my comrades to assist me in emptying 3 canteens of Obie Joyful, then spent the balance of the evening singing. Then we parted in good spirits.
In March 1863, John Mosby's Confederate Rangers raided Fairfax Courthouse, Virginia, capturing 2 captains, 30 privates, 58 horses, and Brigadier General Edwin Stoughton.
Jordan on the carry.
For that, I am sorry, Lincoln said when told of the capture. For I can make brigadier generals, but I can't make horses. General Mosby had made life miserable for Northern commanders throughout the war. No other Confederate officer was mentioned favorably as many times in Robert E. Lee's dispatches as John Singleton Mosby.
3rd and 5.
There were no medals in the Confederate Army, not one in the whole course of the war. The Confederate reason for that given was that they were all heroes and it would not do to single anyone out. They were not all heroes. But there was a suggestion made to Lee that there be a roll of honor for the Army of Northern Virginia, and Lee disallowed it. The highest honor you could get in the Confederate Army was to be mentioned in dispatches, and that was considered absolutely enough.
March 5th, 1863. The arm of the slaves is the best defense against the arm of the slaveholder. Who would be free themselves must strike the blow. I urge you to fly to arms and smite with death the power that would bury the government and your liberty in the same hopeless grave. This is our golden opportunity. Frederick Douglass.
The colored population is the great available and yet unavailed of force for restoring the Union. The bare sight of 50,000 armed and drilled black soldiers upon the banks of the Mississippi would end the rebellion at once. And who doubts that we can present that sight if we but take hold in earnest? Abraham Lincoln.
The people most affected by the Emancipation Proclamation obviously did not receive it as news because they knew before Lincoln knew that the war was about emancipation. And moreover, they knew, as perhaps Lincoln did without fully realizing it, and certainly as many people today do not realize, that the Emancipation Proclamation did nothing to get them their freedom. It said that they had a right to go and put their bodies on the line if they had the nerve to believe in it. And many of them had the nerve to believe in it. And many suffered for that.
To Lincoln, it was now clear that harsher measures were needed to destroy the Confederacy. He called for more troops, and in February, pushed a conscription act through Congress. The Emancipation Proclamation had already authorized the arming of freed slaves.
As to the politics of Washington, the most striking thing is the absence of personal loyalty to the president. It does not exist. He has no admirers, no enthusiastic supporters, no one to bet on his head.
The fall elections had not gone well. Fredericksburg only made matters worse, and in Washington, talk of the disaster was everywhere. "If there is a worse place than hell," Lincoln told a visitor, "I am in it."
The single most unpopular act of Lincoln's administration was the Emancipation Proclamation. It not only was horribly unpopular in the Confederacy, where Jefferson Davis called it the most wicked thing that the dark side of humankind had ever come up with, but millions of Northerners responded to it as well. They did not really want a great many Northerners did not want the war to be changed to a war for slave liberation.
Opposition to the war was spreading, especially among Democrats in the heartland: Michigan, Ohio, Iowa, Indiana, and the southern half of Lincoln's own Illinois. The proclamation ignited an anti-war movement in the North. All but 35 men of the 138th Illinois deserted over emancipation, declaring they would lie in the woods until moss grew on their backs, rather than help free the slaves. Groups with names like the Knights of the Golden Circle and Sons of Liberty met in secret and muttered of forcing an end to the war. Their enemies called them Copperheads, and they wore on their lapels the head of liberty, snipped from a copper penny. Their leader was Congressman Clement Vallandigham of Ohio. Lincoln had him thrown in jail and later banished to the Confederacy.
You have not conquered the South. You never will. War for the Union was abandoned, war for the Negro openly begun, and with stronger battalions than before. With what success? Let the dead at Fredericksburg answer.
All of these things bore in on him, plus the fact that the South had a strong army and a good leadership. But then he would pick up a Richmond newspaper and he'd say, here's what they're saying about Jeff Davis down here. I don't look so bad, because the South had a free press too. And he realized, you know, that Jeff was not doing any better than he was as far as they were concerned.
Davis was walking down the street in Richmond one day, and a Confederate soldier who was in Richmond on furlough passed him and stopped him and said, "Sir, mister, bean't you Jefferson Davis?" And Davis said that he was. And the soldier said, "Well, I thought so. You look so much like a Confederate postage stamp."
3-yard gain on the play. Third and 1. Ball on the 21-yard line.
Jefferson Davis was trying to win a war while forging a nation out of 11 states suspicious of even the most trivial move toward centralized government. When Davis called for a day of national fasting, the governor of Georgia ignored it, then named a different fast day of his own.
I entered into this revolution to contribute my might to sustain the rights of states and to prevent the consolidation of the government. And I am still a rebel, no matter who may be in power. Governor Joseph Brown of Georgia.
Janikowski in to attempt a field goal.
The Confederacy has been done to death by politicians. Mary Chestnut.
Pardon me, a South Carolinian wrote his congressman. Is the majority always drunk? Vice President Alexander Stephens believed Davis weak and vacillating, timid, petulant, peevish, obstinate. Stephens left Richmond in 1862, rarely to return. "I make no terms," Davis once said. "I accept no compromise." He refused to unbend in public or to curry favor with the press. Privately, he commuted nearly every death sentence for desertion that reached his desk, explaining that the poorest use of a soldier was to shoot him.
He's often described as a bloodless pedant, a man who filled all his time with small-time paperwork and never anything else, an icy cold man who had no friendliness in him. I found the opposite to be true in all those respects. Davis is an outgoing, friendly man, a great family man, loved his wife and children, infinite store of compassion. Lee said it best. He said, "I don't think anyone could name anyone who could have done a better job than Davis did, and I personally don't know of anyone who could have done as good a job." That's from Robert E. Lee, which is a pretty good thought.
Tomlinson with the carry. 1-yard loss.
Davis may well have been the only Southerner who understood Southern nationality, who understood what sacrifices had to be made if the Confederacy was ever going to gel as a nation. He kept saying, "I need the kind of powers that Lincoln got. I need the kind of resources that he got in the draft laws. I need to be able to suspend the writ of habeas corpus like he did." He would have said, "We can't live by the dogmas of the quiet past any longer." He didn't say that, but he acted that out. He said, "I have to be given the kinds, this Confederate government needs the kind of national authority, national power that the Union had in order to win." And they didn't get it because the states' rights helped kill the Confederacy.
A single cake of soap now cost $1.10, a tenth of a soldier's monthly pay. At the beginning of 1863, a barrel of flour cost $70 in the South. By year's end, it cost $250. The Confederate Treasury cranked out millions of dollars in notes unbacked by gold. Southern printing was so primitive that counterfeiters were sometimes caught because their work was too good.
By 1862 and 63, the South suffered from terrible inflationary currency. What was really at a premium was a Union gold dollar, so that the Confederate people could never get away from the Union, not even economically.
If the Confederacy is defeated, it will be by the people at home. Atlanta Southern Confederacy.
Thousands of women, infuriated by soaring prices, stormed through downtown Richmond shops, smashing windows and gathering up armfuls of food and clothing. Troops tried to stop them. Jefferson Davis himself came out, throwing what money he had in his pockets to the crowd and begging them to blame the Yankees, not the government. Then he warned the troops would open fire if they did not disperse. The women straggled home.
Gain of 4.
Patriotic planners would willingly put their own flesh and blood into the Army, But when they were asked for a Negro, it was like drawing an eye tooth. Senator Louis T. Wigfall, Texas.
Farmers were called upon to contribute 1/10 of their produce, and the Confederate Army was empowered to impress male slaves as laborers, provided a monthly fee was paid to their masters. Planters moved their slaves inland away from the government and the fighting. 150,000 slaves were marched all the way to Texas. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, died along the way.
3rd and 9. Ball on the 26-yard line.
War Trace, Tennessee, June the 10th, 1863. I have just heard from Hilliard's Legion. They're deserting every day. They say they don't get enough to eat. I've just bought me a Testament. I gave $2 for it. Everything's high here. Benjamin Franklin Jackson.
I saw a sight today that made me feel mighty bad. I saw a man shot for deserting. There was 24 guns at him, and they shot him all to pieces. He went home, and they brought him back, and then he went home again, so they shot him for that. Martha, it was one sight that I did hate to see.
Catch made at the 24-yard line. They'll start the drive at the 24-yard line.
By the end of the year, 2/5 of the Southern Army would be absent, with or without leave.
1-yard gain.
Deserters sometimes banded together, often fed and clothed by Union sympathizers. In North Carolina, the pro-Union Heroes of America had over 10,000 members.
Gain of 2 on
By the end of the war, Unionists from every Confederate state except South Carolina had sent regiments to the north. In Jones County, Mississippi, a guerrilla band ran off tax collectors, burned bridges, and ambushed Confederate columns for 3 years. Reporters called the region the Kingdom of Jones.
How I wish you could hear the music of this encampment tonight. Just stand out in the open air a little while and listen. All seems happy, and all seems gay, but still, could you look into their hearts, you would see thoughts of the loved ones that they have left at home rise above their mirth and gaiety. Yet they are contented, though not happy. Contented to do their duty. Contented to bear their part in this war and sing sad thoughts away.
Dear Fanny, I don't know what we should have done without our band. It's acknowledged by everyone to be the best in the division. Every night about sundown, Gilmore gives us a splendid concert, playing selections from the operas and some very pretty marches, quick steps, waltzes, and the like.
Troops sang in camp and on the way to battle. Confederates favored Dixie and the Bonnie Blue flag. Union soldiers still preferred an old Methodist tune. Mostly they liked sentimental songs. Just Before the Battle, Mother, The Vacant Chair, All Quiet Along the Potomac, and Home Sweet Home. In many camps, the men were forbidden to play a song called Weeping, Sad, and Lonely, officers considering it destructive of morale. Both sides loved Lorena.
Jordan with the carry. Gain of 8 on the play. Third and 1. Ball on the 7-yard line.
April 14th, 1863, Rappahannock River, Virginia, near Franklin's Crossing. General Thomas J. Jackson came down to the riverbank today with a party of ladies and officers. We raised our hats to the party, and strange to say, the ladies waved their handkerchiefs in reply. General Jackson took his field glasses and coolly surveyed our party. We could have shot him with a revolver, but we have an agreement that neither side will fire, as it does no good, and in fact is simply murder.
Oakland
Elisha Hunt Rhodes.
Cromartie back deep to return. Kickoff return 26 yards.
General, I have placed you at the head of the Army of the Potomac. I have heard, in such a way as to believe it, of your recently saying that both the Army and the government needed a dictator. Of course, it was not for this, but in spite of this, that I have given you the command. Only those generals who gain successes can set up as dictators. What I now ask of you is military success, and I will risk the dictatorship. Abraham Lincoln.
The intended receiver on the play.
Again, Lincoln turned to a new general. He replaced Burnside with Joseph Hooker, a tenacious West Pointer called Fighting Joe, who drank and talked too much for his own good. It was absolutely necessary, Lincoln told him, to destroy Lee's army.
My plans are perfect. May God have mercy on General Lee, for I will have none.
Calls a timeout. 1st and 10. Ball on the 35-yard line.
Hooker's plans called for one part of his enormous army to feign an assault on Lee's front, still at Fredericksburg, while the rest marched up the Rappahannock, crossed the river, and attacked Lee from the rear.
3rd and 9. Ball on the 34-yard
On April
line.
30th, Hooker's main force, 70,000 strong, reached Chancellorsville, a lone house in a clearing surrounded by a thick forest called the Wilderness. Hooker and his officers moved in downstairs and continued to map out the assault they were sure would trap Lee.
The enemy must either ingloriously fly or come out from behind his defenses and give us battle upon our own ground, where certain destruction awaits him.
The hen is the wisest of all the animal creation, because she never cackles until after the egg is laid.
The pass falls incomplete. Jackson, the intended receiver.
But Robert E. Lee, outnumbered nearly 2-to-1, was not fooled by Hooker's plan. Defying all military convention, he divided his own much smaller force, leaving only a quarter of his men at Fredericksburg before rushing west to shore up his flank. When Lee's Confederates reached the edge of the Wilderness, Union troops moved out to engage them. Fighting had hardly begun when Fighting Joe Hooker inexplicably ordered his forces back to defensive positions around the Chancellor House. To tell the truth, he later tried to explain, I just lost confidence in Joe Hooker. Lee sensed Hooker's confusion, and the next day divided his army a second time, sending 28,000 men under Stonewall Jackson on an extraordinary 14-mile march through the dense wilderness and around the Union's right flank.
Kickoff return 19 yards. Carr on the return.
Hooker somehow persuaded himself that Jackson was actually retreating, and despite the skeletal rebel force remaining in front of him, chose to stay in camp. All day long came reports from terrified Union pickets of a huge rebel force moving just beyond the screen of trees to the west. They were ignored. Late that afternoon, Union troops were boiling coffee and playing cards when deer came bounding out of the forest and through their camp. Jackson's army was right behind them. It was a perfect whirlwind of men, a survivor said. The enemy seemed to come from every direction. The Federals fell back nearly 2 miles before darkness stopped the Confederate sweep.
Chancellorsville, in many ways, is Lee's masterpiece. It's where the odds were longest. It's where he took the greatest risk in dividing his army in the presence of a superior enemy and kept the pressure on.
5-yard gain.
The real fault at Chancellorsville was the attack was staged so late in the day that they were not able to push it to the extent that Jackson had intended to, and he was even attempting to make a night attack, a very rare thing in the Civil War, because he knew that he hadn't finished up what he'd started to begin.
Eager to fight on, Jackson rode out between the lines that evening to scout for a night attack. When he turned back toward his men, nervous Confederate pickets opened fire. 2 of his aides fell dead. Jackson was hit twice in the left arm.
2nd and 12. Ball on the 33-yard
His shattered arm was amputated the next morning. Lee was horrified. He has lost his left arm, he said, but I have lost my right. Hooker continued to bumble. As he nervously watched the fighting from the porch of the Chancellor House, a shell split the pillar he was leaning against and knocked him senseless.
9-yard loss on the play.
Groggy all day, he refused to relinquish command. Finally, he ordered retreat.
Ball on the 24-yard line.
The defeat was total. Again, the Union Army withdrew across the Rappahannock. Hooker had lost 17,000 men, even more than at Fredericksburg.
Kenny with the reception. First down on the play.
My God, said Lincoln when he got the news. What will the country say?
1st and 10. Ball on the 45.
Chancellorsville was Lee's most brilliant victory and one of the costliest. 13,000 of his men were dead or out of action. But it was the loss of one man that concerned him most. Stonewall Jackson seemed to be recuperating. Then on Sunday, May 10th, he took a turn for the worse.
The scene is in a bedroom in which he's coming in and out of consciousness. Pneumonia is what he died of, not the loss of his arm.
Ball on the 40-yard line.
And his wife got there to be with him. And the surgeon, Dr. McGuire, told Miss Jackson that her husband would die that day. And she told him, said, the doctor says that you won't last a day out. And he said, oh no, my child, it's not that serious. And then finally she said, you will be with the Lord this day.
35-yard line.
And he went off into some sort of sleepy delirium. Pneumonia affects people in strange ways. And he called the doctor and says, Dr. McGuire, my wife tells me I'm going to die today. Is that true? And the doctor said, yes, it is. He said, good, very good. I always wanted to die on a Sunday.
Number 18.
But when they offered him brandy or morphine, he said, no, I want to keep my mind clear. And the last thing he said is sort of, he wandered in his mind. He was calling on A.P. Hill and prepare for action. And then all of a sudden he was quiet, and very quiet for a spell. And he said in a clear, distinct voice, let us cross over the river and rest under the shade of the trees, and then died.
The death of our pious, brave, and noble General Stonewall Jackson is a great blow to our cause.
First and 10. Ball on the 44-yard line.
Winfield Scott, Henry Halleck, Irvin McDowell, George McClellan, John Pope, George McClellan again, Ambrose Burnside, Joseph Hooker. Lincoln could not find the general he needed. He now knew that to win the war, the Southern armies had to be crushed. He had the men, but he needed a general with the will to use them.
No general yet found can face the arithmetic, but the end of the war will be at hand when he shall be discovered. Vicksburg is the key. The war can never be brought to a close until the key is in our pocket.
A long line of high, rugged, irregular bluffs, clearly cut against the sky, crowned with cannon, which peered ominously from embrasures to the right and left as far as the eye could see. That is Vicksburg.
For 2.5 months, Ulysses S. Grant doggedly attempted to dig or hack or float his army through the tangled bayous and seize the town of Vicksburg. Nothing worked. The press accused him of sloth and stupidity, hinted he was drinking again. Finally, Grant decided on a daring plan. He would march downriver through the swamps on the western side, cross below Vicksburg, and without hope of resupply or reinforcement, come up from behind and attack the city.
Darling on the interception.
By early May, Grant had crossed the river.
When this was effected, I felt a degree of relief scarcely ever equaled since. I was now in the enemy's country, with a river and the stronghold of Vicksburg between me and my base of supply. But I was on dry ground, on the same side of the river with the enemy.
The men knew they were cut loose.